Come on in. Welcome to Opening the Door to Diabetes.
So we've talked a couple times about the relationship between insulin and glucose. Is there a way of sort of visualizing how those two change throughout the day?
Yeah, and my technical guru Nelson's helped me with some of these graphs, and so I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining and showing with the graphs what normal glucose and insulin values are.
And these levels would be taken by measuring your glucose by your blood every
Well,
so often?
if I can tell a little bit of a story here, my old boss in Edmonton, George Molnar, did this original data way back in the 1970s. And although this is folklore, it is said that he took a number of medical students who had not done well on their endocrinology rotation and put them in the clinical investigation unit for a couple of days in order to get all of this data. So what he did was he had a very disciplined approach in this experiment where he had the students wake up at the same time, eat the same thing, go to bed at the same time, and they had their blood sugars continuously measured throughout this 24-hour period. And this is what the graph looks like. So you can see as they're waking up, glucose levels are quite low. They have a breakfast and the glucose goes up but not so high. Then it comes right down after the breakfast at what we call baseline until the next meal, which is at lunchtime, where it pops up again but then pops down again because the insulin in their body is working.
Okay, so every time you eat, your body's able to break stuff down into the glucose, and that's why it pops up for a little bit.
It's absorbed, and you can measure it in the blood.
Okay.
But it's very quickly disposed of, and that goes back to what we talked about last time, which was the glucose getting into the cells where it can do its work. Now, how does it do that? Well, the hormone insulin. And so here we see with the red graph, insulin before breakfast is very, very low, but it's not zero, it's always there. And here at breakfast time, there's a nice big peak, which we call the first phase of insulin secretion, usually associated with the anticipation of eating. And then the second phase, which is associated with the actual glucose levels stimulating the islet cells, which make insulin in the body, that so-called second phase of insulin secretion.
So your body makes insulin in preparation, kind of like your mouth watering?
Yeah, it's a very good analogy. And that's what's happening, is that the body's getting prepared to deal with that food. It knows it's coming. And then the second phase of insulin secretion deals with the glucose levels that are actually there. And this recurs with each meal, as we can see in this diagram. So it does vary, but it always has a very similar shape.
All right, so now we can see here the way that it's a direct correlation. Every time there's a bump in glucose, there's a bump in insulin.
Correct, and so there's a stimulus and a response.
Okay, so this is a really defined relationship that works really well, but obviously in type 1 and 2 diabetes, this would be not functioning correctly.
Absolutely correct. So in type 1 diabetes, there's an absolute lack of insulin. So insulin's missing in action. So if we have the normal glucose curve we can see in the bottom here, which we just reviewed, and in type 1 diabetes, we're going to show this roller coaster of glucose levels when you measure them continuously through the day, which can be really very, very disruptive to obviously the patient who is having to live through these ups and downs of the glucose levels in their blood. Interspersed in there with the red dots, you can see those are insulin injections. So the insulin injection goes in, they've had a meal, the meal goes up, comes down until lunchtime, and the same thing is repeated. But you can see it's a very poor imitation of what in this case is going on compared to the normal.
So it's really all over the map there. It seems like even with the insulin injections, you're still getting up to 15 or 17 millimoles.
That's correct. And in this case, having a patient such as this would require a lot of work in order to get the diet part correct, the insulin dose correct, in hopes of getting those curves closer to normal.
So in this case, you have to monitor it constantly and have injections of insulin. In case 2, type 2 diabetes, insulin injections aren't always required, so the graph would look really different.
Yeah, and remember that type 2 diabetes is a relative insulin lack levels. So it's quite a different graph. And here we go with showing glucose levels, again showing a bigger peak after a meal, not coming down to baseline quite as well, and generally being higher for longer after a meal. And part of the reason for that is one of the first things that happens with somebody with type 2 diabetes is that they lose their first phase of insulin secretion. So that allows that glucose level to escape into the blood. And so their insulin peaks are quite different from the normal with the first and second phase of insulin secretion.
And to review, that first phase of insulin secretion, as in right before the meal, or something
Exactly,
ready for the meal?
yeah. And so you can see that there still remains that relationship between insulin secretion and glucose levels. Okay, so that they're still there, it's still working, but just not as effectively. So it isn't the randomness that you see with the type 1 patient, but it's just too high.
And so if I were the person that had diabetes, part of my daily routine would be somewhat keeping track of these kind of levels and almost making a graph like this so I could see how it's working?
That's right, and that's going to be the theme of another video. What should you really measure and when? But you have to understand what glucose levels should be and how to get them there in order to treat either type 1 or type 2 diabetes properly. So control of glucose is absolutely essential.
Well, these graphs have been really useful. If you want to take a closer look at the graphs, we'll have them as PDFs on the site as well, right below the video. So you can take a look at those and tune in for our next one. Have a good one.